They tore down my home because my flower garden clashed with their sleek modern taste. So, I turned a single old Valvia, and that's when everything began to unravel. The HOA president believed she ruled everything with her fake permits and bulldozers, but what she didn't realize was that my land hid an old secret and a kind of power she'd never imagined. What started as a petty citation spiraled into a fight that pulled in the entire neighborhood. No one, not even her, was prepared for what came next. Would you have stood your ground? Let me know where you're watching from, because this story takes a sudden twist. My name's Travis Murphy. About 6 months back, I spent every last cent of my savings to buy 20 acres of land just beyond Willowbrook Estates. After 15 years trapped in bland apartments with gray concrete walls and constant weather updates, I finally stepped onto a porch made of gently curved wood, beneath pine walls breathing out the scent of the forest. For the first time, it felt like I was touching something real. I'd worked for years studying weather data for the government, and I'd had enough. This land felt like an escape, a chance to build something tangible with my own hands, instead of just crunching numbers that nobody ever read. Using everything I had, I built a simple wooden house, nothing elaborate, just cedar boards, a porch wrapping around the front, and real windows that opened to bring in fresh air instead of the stale hum of recycled ventilation. The place used to belong to an old rancher who'd passed away, and his family had sold it off quickly. Stepping from my old life in government offices to this peaceful patch of earth felt like going from black and white to living color. One late spring morning, I was kneeling in my flower garden, tugging weeds out from between the wildflowers I'd planted. My hands were covered in soil, but it felt good, honest work after so many years behind the desk. Bees drifted lazily around the lavender, and sunlight spilled through the oak branches over my porch. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd finally found my place. The property came with a narrow creek out back, some long-neglected flower beds I'd been restoring, and a peace I hadn't known since I was a kid. I was brushing dirt from my palms when I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. A shiny silver BMW rolled up, looking as out of place on my land as a rocket ship. Out stepped a woman in her late 30s, blonde hair perfectly styled, holding a clipboard thick with documents, and wearing a smile that never reached her eyes. Her high heels somehow didn't sink into the earth, like she'd never really belonged anywhere with real grass underfoot. She strode up to my garden like someone born to give orders. "Good morning," she called out, stretching out a manicured hand at the edge of my flower bed. "I'm Maria Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your situation here." I got to my feet, wiping soil off my jeans, knowing right away this wasn't a friendly visit. The contrast between us couldn't have been clearer. Me, covered in honest garden dirt, her, pristine, polished, and wrapped in suburban certainty. Her polite smile stiffened as she flipped through her papers, as though she'd memorized the lines in advance. "Your wooden house doesn't meet community standards. We require brick or stucco. And this garden of yours a broken bar." She paused, saying natural like it tasted bitter, waving a hand at the wildflowers I'd spent months nursing back to life. She studied my flower beds the way an inspector might scan a crime scene, searching for violations against her spotless vision of suburbia. I glanced past her, toward the steel fence marking the edge of the real HOA development, a line of identical beige homes, each with a perfectly mowed lawn so flawless it looked painted on. Not a wildflower, not even a single dandelion inside, a just lifeless turf kept alive by landscaping crews that probably cost more every month than I spent on groceries. It looked like a place where nature had been erased and replaced with something fake. "I bought this land fair and square," I told her, keeping my voice calm but steady. "It's been private property since the 1800s, so long before your HOA ever existed. The records are clear. This lot was never part of any homeowners association." Her expression shifted in an instant, a polite mask falling away to show a colder edge, like someone flipping a switch from courtesy to enforcement. "Mr. Murphy, when we extended our community boundaries last year, your property came under our jurisdiction," she said. "You have 30 days to make your house compliant or face fines and possible legal action." She pushed a thick stack of paperwork toward me with the confidence of someone who'd handed out dozens of these before. "This is your official notice of violations. along with our architectural guidelines and a list of approved contractors. I recommend you get started today. I took the papers but didn't open them. Instead, I watched as a pickup truck rumbled slowly down the dirt road behind my property. Its driver, a middle-aged man in work clothes, raised a friendly hand in greeting. He ran the sheep ranch that bordered my back fence, and I'd often seen his flock by the creek that ran from my land to his. Hundreds of woolly heads clustered together, drinking clear water, completely unaware of the conflict growing between their neighbor and the woman in my driveway. "Tell me something, Mrs. Whitmore," I said, setting the packet on the porch rail. "What's your real interest in my 20 acres? Because this doesn't feel like you are here to talk about paint colors." For just a heartbeat, something sharp flickered behind her eyes, a look that measured opportunity in dollars and development potential. "Our community is about protecting everyone's property values, Mr. Murphy," she said, recovering her careful tone. "Your unconventional choices affect the entire neighborhood." She turned to leave, her heels tapping on my porch steps like a countdown. At the bottom, she paused. 30 days, she repeated. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." As her BMW vanished down the road in a small cloud of dust, something caught my eye, a piece of old pipe jutting out from under the porch, capped with rusted metal and half buried under years of dirt. It looked ancient, like it belonged to another era entirely, and for reasons I couldn't quite name, it kept tugging at my thoughts. The next morning, dawn's quiet was shattered by the rhythmic hammering of metal on earth. I threw on jeans and stepped outside to see two men in work clothes pounding bright red stakes into the ground around my flower beds with a kind of grim precision. They had surveying equipment set up, measuring distances down to the inch. In the morning light, the stakes stood out like tiny red warning flags planted squarely in my piece. Maria Whitmore clearly wasn't wasting time. 3 days after her visit, another notice appeared taped to my front door, this one citing me for excessive grass height in areas where I'd deliberately let the prairie grass grow wild. The fine was $50, said to double every week until I complied. 2 days later, a fresh violation landed, non-conforming tree placement, because my oak trees apparently cast shadows across what Maria insisted was a public easement. By the end of that first week, I'd accumulated 4 violations and $200 in fines, all for choosing to live on my own land in a way that didn't fit her carefully curated vision. The harassment only escalated. Contractors showed up to trim my trees that supposedly hung over the property line, reaching across my fence without so much as asking. Inspectors arrived unannounced, clipboards and measuring tapes in hand, clearly searching for problems rather than checking for safety. Each morning brought a new slip of paper taped to my door or stuffed into my mailbox of violations for the color of my window trim, for the placement of a garden hose, even for my porch furniture. It was relentless, a death by 1,000 citations. But Maria's real genius was the story she spun around it. Every letter from the HOA was wrapped in the language of community values and preserving property values, painting her as the reasonable protector of order and me as the stubborn outsider threatening the neighborhood's peace. I started to realize this wasn't about flower beds or paint colors. My 20 acres represented something far more valuable to Maria, space for dozens of new homes. And she was determined to break me down, fine by fine, until I either conformed or left. The social isolation that followed cut deeper than the fines. One afternoon, I saw my neighbor Elizabeth at the corner lot, gently watering her perfect rose bushes. I raised a hand and called out a friendly greeting as I always had. She looked up, hesitated, then took half a step back. Her eyes darted toward the HOA office before settling back on me. "A broken bar. I was advised not to get involved, Travis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, heavy with regret. "I hope you understand." The shame and fear in her words said more than she realized. Maria had turned even longtime neighbors into silent allies of her campaign, warning them off from any sign of friendliness toward me. Elizabeth, who once brought me homemade cookies when I moved in, now treated me like I carried something contagious. Heartbroken and angry, I turned my attention back to the land. While trying to make sense of what the surveyors were measuring, I dug around one of the red stakes and uncovered something that made my pulse quicken. What I thought was a boundary marker turned out to be cast iron, with words worn but still legible. Water Control 1893, letters carved deep into the metal, like a warning from the past. Beneath that, half hidden by dirt, was the outline of a heavy valve wheel. Realization sparked in my chest. My background in environmental systems told me that water rights this old were no small thing, especially in Texas, where water meant survival, power, and money. I pried up the iron cover, revealing a dark shaft dropping about 4 feet to a rusted but solid valve assembly. And beneath the earth, I heard it, the faint, steady rush of water still moving through unseen pipes, driven by curiosity and something else, maybe hope. I gripped the valve wheel and turned it gently a quarter turn counterclockwise. Then I hurried to the creek that cut across the back of my property. Within minutes, the steady flow slowed to a trickly broken bar, then stopped completely. Smooth stones and muddy banks, hidden for decades, emerged in the sunlight. Heart pounding, I ran back and turned the valve back the other way. Moments later, the creek resumed its flow, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. In that instant, I understood. I wasn't as powerless as Maria believed. That hidden valve didn't just control the creek behind my house, it controlled the water that fed Tom Whitmore's sheep ranch, home to 1,500 animals whose survival depended on that flow. That night, I drove to the county clerk's office. For 3 hours, I pored over brittle papers and scanned yellowed microfilm, piecing together deeds and water rights that dated back over a century. By the time I left, the picture had become clear. My 20 acres weren't just a patch of dirt, they were the keystone to a system of water rights that could shift control of the entire area. Maria's campaign to bully me into submission, compared to what I'd uncovered, it suddenly felt like child's play. It wasn't just any patch of land, it was the original control point for the Willow Creek, established back in 1893 when the first ranchers settled here. The water rights tied to it were grandfathered into my deed, legal, documented, and unassailable. The next morning, I was at the mailbox when Tom Whitmore's pickup rumbled to a stop. Tom was a big man with weathered hands and deep lines etched by sun and worry, the kind of man who understood land in his bones. "Morning, Travis," he called, leaning out the window. "Strange thing yesterday. Creek behind my pasture ran dry for about 15 minutes, then came back just as quick. You notice anything up your way?" I studied his fascia, concerned, but not suspicious. "Can't say I did, Tom. Maybe a beaver dam broke loose upstream." He nodded slowly. "Maybe so. Still, got me worried. 1,500 sheep drink a lot of water." Before I could say more, he tipped his hat and drove off. His worry stuck with me. Maria's next move landed like a hammer. At 6 a.m., I woke to the deep, mechanical growl of heavy machinery, utterly out of place in the quiet I'd built for myself. Still half asleep, I stumbled to the door in my pajamas. Outside, a bulldozer was rolling toward the edge of my flower garden, its blade already scraping across the wildflowers I'd nurtured for months. Behind it idled a dump truck marked emergency demolition. 3 men in hard hats unloaded chainsaws and rakes. And there, standing 20 feet away with a clipboard and a look of quiet satisfaction, was Maria Whitmore, business suit immaculate, eyes hard and cold. She watched as if this were a show staged for her amusement. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, running barefoot across the gravel toward the bulldozer. One of the workers stepped in my path, hand raised. "Sorry, sir, we've got a work order. Emergency removal of unsafe vegetation and structures. Gonna need you to stay back for safety." I spun toward Maria, fury rising. "Emergency removal? They're flowers, Maria. There's nothing unsafe about wildflowers." She lifted a stack of papers with official stamps and letterhead. "Actually, Mr. Murphy, we held an emergency home meeting last night," she said, voice dripping with mock politeness. "Received reports of hazardous plant growth and unstable structures. The board voted unanimously to authorize immediate remediation for community safety." My heart sank. "What meeting?" "I got no notice." "You're required to give notice." Maria's smile widened, pure malice in her eyes. "Oh, but we did send notice." "Check your mailbox, it should be there." I ran to the mailbox, tearing through yesterday's mail. Nothing. No agenda, no meeting notice. "There's nothing here," I called back. Maria shrugged, feigning indifference. "Perhaps it got delayed." "Regardless, the decision was made. These men have their orders." Then, Dropping the pretense, she added, "This place has no room for what you call individuality, Mr. Murphy." The casual cruelty in her tone froze my blood. She wasn't just destroying plants, she was aiming to destroy me. I pulled out my phone and started recording as the bulldozer blade lowered, biting into the earth. Months of careful planting vanished in seconds. Native grasses meant to draw birds and butterflies, bright wildflowers that turned the yard into a living canvas. My vegetable patch of tomatoes, herbs, small shoots just starting to thrive flattened into churned mud. The scent of lavender from Arizona, brought home years ago and planted near the porch, mixed with diesel fumes and wet soil. It felt like watching my memories crushed under steel threads. Each plant, each sapling ripped from the ground felt like losing a piece of myself. Maria stood there, arms folded, the glow of victory in her eyes, but what she didn't see was how crossing this line changed everything. Until now, I tried to compromise, to stay reasonable. But when she moved from fines to outright destruction, she turned me from someone defending his land into someone with nothing left to lose. The bulldozer shifted toward my small tool shed, splintering the wood as the workers claimed it was an unpermitted structure. Chainsaws whined as they moved to the young apple and pear trees I'd planted by the fence, linear saplings meant for a future I was trying to build. "This is illegal," I shouted. "You can't do this without proper notice." One of the men hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. "Sir, we're just following work orders. If you got an issue, take it up with the HOA." The shriek of chainsaws cutting living wood mingled with the rumble of machinery, a soundtrack to laws that would echo in my mind long after the noise stopped. I kept filming, but the video couldn't capture the smell of fresh-cut apple blossoms mixing with exhaust, or how my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. After they left, I stood there in the silence they'd left behind, staring at the crushed stems and turned earth where my garden had been. My chest felt hollow, the air sharp and painful to breathe. Maria thought she'd won, but what she'd really done was show me exactly what I was fighting and why I could never back down again. I stood there, looking out over what had once been my garden, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The rage still burned hot, but beneath it settled a colder, more deliberate anger, one that felt far more dangerous than shouting ever could. Up until now, I tried to handle this the reasonable way, following procedures, hoping that logic and fairness might prevail. But Maria had shown me exactly what she was willing to do. This wasn't about rules. She wanted me gone, and she'd destroy anything I cared about to get her way. The rest of that day, I was on the phone with every HOA board member I could track down. What I learned confirmed what I'd suspected. Of the 12 board members, only 3 had even heard about Maria's so-called emergency meeting, and none recalled voting on an emergency demolition. 2 were stunned to learn any meeting had taken place at all. I had proof that Maria had fabricated the meeting and forged the permits, but by then, my garden was already rubble. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on my porch staring at bulldozer tracks slicing through the place that had been my refuge. Tom Whitmore's truck pulled up slowly. He got out, taking in the destruction with a grim face. "Jesus, Travis," he muttered. "What happened here?" I told him everything. The fake meeting, the forged permits, the deliberate destruction, with each detail. Tom's expression darkened. When I finished, he shook his head heavily. "This is my wife's doing, isn't it?" The words came out flat, like he already knew the answer. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to keep playing defense while Maria tore my life apart piece by piece. It was time she learned I had weapons she didn't know about. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. It was calm, factual and backed by evidence, records proving the fabricated meeting and forged permits. At the end, I included a single warning: one more violation, and I'd invoke my 1893 water rights. Then I hand-delivered the letters myself. Each delivery felt like dropping a small explosive into their neat, comfortable suburban order. To drive the point home, I built a wooden sign right at my property's edge: Historical Water System Rights, established 1893. The sign was factual, legal, and impossible to miss. I also placed wooden stakes around the underground water control system, marking the boundaries of what I now understood to be the most strategically important 20 acres in the area. By evening, passing cars slowed to read the sign. Neighbors whispered instead of waving. One man muttered, "If it's real, we're sitting on a water bomb." His voice held something Maria had never inspired in them before: real fear. Word spread quickly. The story wasn't just about flower beds anymore. Now it was about someone who might control the water that sustained every lawn and pasture in Willow Creek. When I dropped the last letter into the assistant HOA president's mailbox, my hand shook, and not from fear of Maria, but because I knew there was no going back. I had just declared open war on a woman who'd already proven she'd do anything to win, and I was staking everything on century-old water rights that hadn't been tested in modern courts. Maria's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours, she pulled up to my property herself. Middle of the day, fury carved deep into her face, crowbar in hand. She stomped over to my property markers. "You can't put up unauthorized signage," she yelled, prying at the posts. "And you sure as hell can't claim you control the water. This is harassment." I stayed seated on my porch, quietly filming everything. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," I replied, voice steady, "these markers are documented in the county records. Would you like me to call the sheriff while you finish destroying legal property?" She stopped, crowbar halfway raised. Her eyes met mine, then dropped. With a hiss of frustration, she threw the tool down and stormed back to her car. "This isn't over, Murphy," she shouted over her shoulder. The words echoed across the yard. But for the first time since this started, I realized I wasn't the only one who looked cornered. Maria had just shown the entire neighborhood she was willing to break the law when challenged, and I had it all on video. More importantly, her reaction proved that my claim over the water had rattled her badly enough to make her lose control. The next morning brought a new escalation. Maria called an emergency home meeting, a real one this time, and sent official notices to every resident. The single agenda item: discussion and vote on the Travis Murphy situation and his threats to community water access. She was scrambling to regain control. What she didn't see was that her own husband would be there, and Tom Whitmore was already starting to ask uncomfortable questions about what she'd really done. I spent the day before the meeting preparing. I gathered everything: historical maps of the Willow Creek watershed, county records proving my water rights, and photographs of the garden Maria's demolition crew had destroyed. Then I packed something else: a small portable pump wired to my phone, ready to demonstrate exactly how the underground water system worked. If Maria wanted a public confrontation about water, I would give her one she wouldn't forget. By 7 p.m., the community center parking lot was packed. People had come for a showdown. As I walked in, carrying my maps and pump, eyes followed me across the room. Maria was already at the podium, shuffling her papers, lips pressed tight. This was her domain, surrounded by neighbors and her authority as HOA president. But even from across the room, I could see it: the faint stiffness in her shoulders, the nervous glance at the crowd. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she'd win. Neighbors and the authority she carried as HOA president had always been Maria's shield. But for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something crack in her posture. The confident woman who had ordered bulldozers onto my land was starting to realize she might have picked a fight with someone who wasn't as helpless as she'd assumed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maria began, voice tight, "we're here tonight because one of our neighbors has made threats against our community's water supply." She launched into a practiced speech about property values and community standards, painting me as an outsider trying to blackmail the neighborhood with fabricated water rights. But as she spoke, I caught sight of Tom Whitmore in the third row. With every accusation Maria leveled, Tom's expression shifted from confusion, to disbelief, to something closer to hurt. When Maria finally finished and opened the floor, I rose, carrying my maps and the small pump. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," I said, stepping to the front. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply informed the board of my documented, enforceable legal rights. I spread the old survey maps across the table. Faded lines clearly showed that the control valve for the entire underground water system lay directly under my front porch. The room went silent. I kept my voice calm and measured, refusing to match Maria's aggressive tone. Then I pulled out my phone and played the video. Maria, crowbar in hand, tearing down my sign. "This," I said evenly, "is what harassment actually looks like." Finally, I turned to my demonstration. "And here's how the system works," I said, connecting the portable pump to my phone. When I activated the valve, the real-time display showed a sharp drop in water pressure. The silence turned uneasy. People shifted in their seats, seeing for themselves that my claim wasn't empty. A woman near the center stood up, voice edged with fear. "If he controls the water, what happens if the hoe keeps pushing him?" An elderly man near the back raised his hand. "And who approved the hoe expansion without telling us?" The meeting shifted from routine to something closer to a trial. Questions for ones Maria clearly hadn't prepared for. Then Tom Whitmore rose slowly in the third row. His face was pale, voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Maria, what the hell have you done?" The room turned to look at him. "You told me this was about property values," Tom said, staring at his wife. "You never said a word about water rights or threatening the entire neighborhood's supply." Maria's polished composure cracked. "Tom, sit down. This is Ho business." But Tom wasn't finished. His voice rose, hard and steady. "Ho business? You're playing games with the water supply that feeds my flock of 1,500 sheep. That creek is our lifeline." The weight of his words rolled over the crowd. The revelation that even Maria's husband could be harmed by her actions stunned the room into a heavy silence. Whispers broke out to neighbors realizing this wasn't just about flower beds and fences. This was about water, the single resource keeping their homes and pastures alive. Maria clung to the microphone, knuckles white. Her voice cracked as she tried to rally. "This is exactly what I meant by intimidation," she barked. "He's threatening to hold the entire community hostage over some ancient, probably worthless claim." But her words fell flat. Everyone could see the pump readings on my phone, real evidence that the claim wasn't worthless at all. Tom stepped forward again, voice carrying across the room. "You destroyed his garden, Maria. You forged permits. And now you're surprised he's fighting back?" He turned, addressing the room directly. "My wife lied to me and to all of you. This isn't about community standards. It's about her trying to push the hoe expansion onto his land and being willing to ruin anyone in the way." A heavy silence followed. Maria froze at the podium, the carefully built image of her authority collapsing before everyone's eyes. I packed up my maps and the pump, then turned to the room. "I don't want to hurt anyone's water supply," I said quietly. "All I've ever asked is to be left alone, to live peacefully. But if the harassment keeps coming, I will protect myself, including using the rights the law gives me." As I walked toward the exit, a buzz of urgent conversation rose behind me. Neighbors demanding answers from Maria, questioning what her war with me really meant for them. The balance of power had shifted and everyone in that room knew it. Maria's authority had cracked. Tom had publicly turned against her. And now the neighborhood understood that the comfortable order they'd trusted depended on not pushing me any further. Maria's next move was to double down, but everyone could see she was fighting from a place of fear. And this time, nobody was certain she could win. 3 days after Tom's public confrontation with Maria, I received another batch of violation notices. This time, they claimed my water system demonstration had breached community noise ordinances and public safety regulations. It was obvious she was scrambling and desperately trying to claw back control, but now everyone knew she was risking the entire neighborhood's water supply just to pursue her vendetta against me. The breaking point came when Maria organized what she called a community safety inspection of my property. She brought along a county inspector who clearly had no clue what he was supposed to be looking for. They wandered around for an hour, measuring distances and snapping photos, trying to dig up anything they could use against me. When I asked to see their inspection warrant, the county official sheepishly admitted they didn't have one. Maria had told him it was just a routine compliance check that didn't need court authorization. I kept my voice calm. "Then you're both trespassing," I said, and politely but firmly asked them to leave. When Maria refused, I called the sheriff myself. That night, it became clear Maria would never stop. She'd never compromise, never admit that I had any right to live peacefully on my land. She was willing to risk her husband's livelihood, the community's water, and her own reputation all to drive me out. So I did the only thing left to me, the one move that would end this. After dark, I quietly lifted the iron cover at the base of my porch. The smell of damp earth and old metal rose up, mixing with the distant rush of water far below. One turn of the ancient valve, and the flow stopped. Silence, the kind of silence that comes just after lightning or right before the thunder. I climbed out, replaced the cover, and knew the shockwaves would ripple through the community by morning. The next day was the monthly home meeting. Maria expected another bland discussion about landscaping and mailbox colors. But I had something else in mind. At exactly 10 a.m., just as Maria called the meeting to order in front of nearly 50 residents, I sent Tom a text with 3 words, "Check your creek." 3 minutes later, Maria's phone rang. Tom's voice boomed through the speaker, raw panic breaking through. "The water's gone, Maria. The whole damn creek is dry and the sheep are already stressed." You could hear the desperation, the ragged breathing as Tom shouted into the phone. Maria's face drained of color. "Whatever you did to that man, you better fix it now before I lose everything." Tom's voice cracked under the weight of it. 1,500 sheep, suddenly without water. Maria tried to muffle the call, but it was too late. Everyone had heard. In that moment, the theoretical water dispute turned brutally real. I stood and walked into the meeting room, taking a seat in the back as Tom's frantic voice kept pouring out of Maria's phone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, calm and clear, "I think you all understand the situation now. I control your water supply. Mrs. Whitmore has been harassing me illegally for months and now her husband's livestock is paying the price." The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Tom's voice begging, breathless, describing sheep crowding around empty troughs, crying out in thirst. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Is this real? Did you actually cut off our water?" Maria backed away from the podium, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Faces around her shifted from shock to anger, to outright betrayal as the truth sank in. Their leader had dragged them into a conflict that threatened the very resource they depended on to live. Maria's composure crumbled to anger giving way to panic, then desperation, and finally defeat. Her hair was disheveled, lipstick smudged, hands trembling. The image of the commanding HOA president was gone. She ended Tom's call and turned to me, voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" I stood, my eyes sweeping across the room, meeting the stares of neighbors who had watched this spiral from a petty feud into something far more dangerous. "I want my garden restored. I want you to resign as HOA president. I want a public apology for the illegal destruction of my property and I want full compensation for the damages you've caused." Do that, and the water comes back on. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was Maria's phone, vibrating insistently with another call from Tom. Then, the doors slammed open. Tom burst in, his work clothes dusty, sweat streaking his face, eyes wide with fear. He spotted me, walked over without hesitation and dropped to his knees in front of everyone. "Please," he choked out, his voice cracking, "I'm begging you to turn the water back on. Those sheep did nothing wrong. They're dying out there. I'll do whatever you want, pay whatever you ask, but don't let them suffer because of what my wife did." The sight of this hard-working man, reduced to pleading for the lives of his animals, cut through the room like a blade. No argument, no speech could have made the point clearer. In that moment, everyone understood exactly how far Maria had pushed Thesa and what it had cost. Looking down at Tom Whitmore, kneeling before me and 50 silent witnesses to his wife's downfall, I felt the cold anger that had carried me through weeks of harassment finally begin to fade. Tom had done nothing wrong except marry someone whose ambition had curdled into destruction, and his 1,500 sheep were innocent victims in a battle they never asked to fight. I reached out and helped Tom to his feet. Then, pulling out my phone, I reopened the water valve with a single tap. "The water's back on," I said quietly. "Your sheep are safe." The relief that washed over Tom's face was immediate and overwhelming. Tears streaked down his weathered cheeks as he gripped my hand with both of his. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank you for not letting them pay for her mistakes." Behind him, Maria stood at the podium, looking like she'd aged a decade in an hour. Her hair was disheveled, makeup smeared, and the authority she once wielded had vanished completely. The neighbors who had once trusted her now stared with a mix of disappointment and disbelief. "Now," I said, turning my gaze to Maria, "let's talk about how we move forward." I walked to the front of the community center. Tom followed, no longer an adversary, but something closer to an ally. "Mrs. Whitmore used fake permits to destroy my garden," I began, my voice steady. She harassed me with illegal fines and inspections, and put the entire community's water supply at risk just to try to force me off my land for her own profit. That's unacceptable from anyone, let alone the president of this HOA. Maria tried once more to salvage her position. Her voice trembled. This is an overreaction. I was just trying to protect property values for everyone's benefit. But her words fell flat. Tom turned to her, his voice calm but edged with quiet steel. Maria, you lied to me. You lied to all of us. And you nearly destroyed everything I've built over 20 years. It's time to take responsibility and step down. Right there, the HOA board held an emergency vote. Maria's resignation was accepted unanimously by the other 11 members. They asked Tom to remain and help rebuild trust. Everyone saw he had been as much a victim as I was. The board also voted to create a fund from HOA reserve some money Maria had earmarked for her expansion to restore my garden and compensate me for damages. In the months that followed, Tom and I became unlikely friends. He helped me replant the wildflowers and fruit trees Maria had bulldozed, and his sheep manure turned out to be perfect fertilizer. We discovered we both loved early morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise while his sheep grazed peacefully across the creek. That creek, once a battleground, had become a shared blessing, a symbol that cooperation was stronger than control. Maria's departure from the community was as swift as her fall had been public. Unable to face daily reminders of her disgrace, she left Tom's house within 2 weeks and moved out of town. Tom filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and a fundamental conflict over honesty and responsibility. Last I heard, she'd taken a real estate job in another state far from anyone who knew what she'd tried, and failed, to do. 6 months later, I was sitting on my rebuilt porch as dawn painted the sky in soft gold. Tom's pickup pulled into my driveway. He got out carrying a wheel of cheese wrapped in brown paper, a weekly gift from the sheep whose lives I'd spared. "Morning, Travis," he called, settling into the rocking chair I'd built for his visits. "Sheep are looking good. Creek's running strong, and Patricia says the new HOA rules are working better than anyone hoped." I accepted the cheese with quiet gratitude. "You know," I said, "when I bought this land, I just wanted peace and quiet. Never thought I'd end up fighting a war over water rights and flower beds." Tom chuckled and took a sip of coffee. "Sometimes the best things come from fights we never wanted. Maria thought she could break you because you were one man against her system. She forgot every system depends on resources and you controlled the most important one." I smiled, thinking of the hidden valve system buried beneath my land, and not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder of what really matters. "First time in my life," Tom went on, "that 1,500 sheep were saved by a single turn of a valve." Best neighbors ever. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the creek flow steadily past my garden and toward his fields. And I realized that justice, like water, often moves slowly but it always finds its way around obstacles, until it gets where it belongs.